Now, first, great powers. Let's finish up the second half of chapter 2. The goal of today's class is to apply major concepts and theories to the great power system 1500 2000. That's the goal. Okay, how balanced power works, how power transition works with specific examples, right? How hegemonic stability theory operates, okay, in real life examples. That's the goal. Now, great powers. Now we know what constitutes power. Power is a complex. A lot of different ingredients constitute power. Now, by any measure of power, in the international system, do many states have equally distributed powers, or a handful of states, they possess the majority of power resources? What is correct? Only a handful of states, right? Only a handful of states possess the majority of the world's power resources. Power resources meaning military force, economic power, indicated as GDP level, population, territorial size, right? Legitimacy, population support, things like that, everything, education, cultural power, everything. So not many countries have these. Only a handful of states, right? Only a handful of states. And these states are called great powers. A few dozen states, right? These are called great powers. There are some great powers must have following characteristics. Number one, of all the power resources, great powers must have military power. Military power is the most important. Without military power, it's not great power. Without military power, it's not great power. Maybe economic power, economic capability, a little bit smaller. Okay, some great powers maybe lacking some level of economic power. What's the best example of a great power that have less economic resources? What is the best example? Is North Korea a great power? Russia. Russia is a good example of, as a great power, it's a good example of, right? Lacking some economic power, but still great power club. Because the level of military power it enjoys. So military power is the most important thing, right? As a defining characteristic. Second, great power should have a broader goal, broader, like a comprehensive goal, or even global ambition. It must have broad ambition. If not, it's not a great power. It must have broad ambition that goes beyond its own territory. That's great power. Should be ambitious. Should be ambitious. They care about other countries, right? That's great power. So these two things important, right? Ambitions, military force. Now another question. Membership in the great power club, does it change easily? No. Right? Once you are great power, goes on. Not forever, but almost permanently. Doesn't change quickly. Great power capabilities takes time in building, but once you build it, goes on for a long, long time. Examples. You know that modern international system, modern contemporary international system, contemporary international relations, what's the dividing line? Contemporary modern international system, when did it begin? Modern contemporary international system began 1500. 1500, right? 1500 continues until today. 1500. Why 1500? What's the difference between 1499 and 1500? What's the difference? Maybe the previous pre-modern system, pre-modern international relations, I don't know exactly when it began, but maybe 1499. Let's call it pre-international system. The difference between pre-international system, modern contemporary international system, what's the key difference? What's the key difference between pre-modern, modern, which is we are still part of modern system, although many argue that modern system may be coming to an end, postmodern system may be beginning, right? Difference between pre-modern, modern, the biggest difference, state system, state-based system, okay? The state didn't exist before 1500. The state as a unitary system didn't exist before 1500, right? Before 1500, what are units of international relations? Units of international relations before 1500, feudal system, feudal system, or city-states, or an empire. There was no state. There was no such thing as a state. Okay? State plus nationality. State plus nationality. That's the biggest characteristic of modern system. In other words, the same ethnic group combined to make a state, nation state. That's the modern international system. But before modern system, every different nationality lived together without any notion of making any coherent government or coherent army. There was no president. There was no flag. There was no national flag. Okay? So that modern system began 1500. Let me ask you, my real question is, then this modern system powers rose and fell. Different powers, different great powers rose and fell. 16th century, 17th century, who are the great powers? That's my question. 16th century, 17th century, great powers, who constituted the great power club. 18th century, 19th century, who constituted the great power club? That can be answered by reading section on the great power system, page 61. Page 61, the great power system. It's a story. It's a description of historical story. Then, this storybook, you need to apply those concepts: balance of power, sovereignty, security dilemma, right? Power, hegemony, hegemonic stability, multipolar, bipolar. You need to apply all these in understanding this story, historical script. Then, lots of things you can derive from this section. Lots of things. This 500-year period, modern system, all kinds of stories. But broadly speaking, it was a modern system. It was a state-based system. It was a balance of power system. Balance of power didn't exist without state, right? Balance of power occurred because of states, nation states. Now, great powers also take turns from time to time. 16th, 17th century, these are the great powers, 16th, 17th century. Britain, France, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, which is Turkey. These are the great powers. Okay? 18th, 19th century, Britain, France, Russia, Prussia, later Germany. These are the great powers. What does this mean? This means that great powers rise and fall, but it takes time. Maybe a certain great power system runs for at least 200 years. Then some great powers decline. Others replace. That's what this section shows. Takes time. Almost 200 years. Now, 20th century, you need to think a lot about 20th century. 20th century. Great powers in the 20th century, Russia, the US. Later, China. Even more later, two biggest ones, the US, the single most important, single most powerful country, the US. Then China challenges. Right? Does the US decline? How soon? That's how you think about the present time. Middle powers. Middle powers are powers rank below the great powers. And these middle powers, page 56, a lot of middle powers that are defined. Canada, Italy, Spain, Netherlands, Poland, Ukraine, South Korea, Australia. There is no clear-cut dividing line in doing so. But these are roughly defined as middle powers. Figure 2.3. 2.3, page 55. What does this figure tell you? If you look at this figure, 이현종. If you look at this figure, 2.3, 55, what comes to your mind? Okay, what does the figure 2 mean in terms of time frame? It was about 2009, right? It is about 2009, which means quite recent. The US has a unilateral power, so it's not strange when the US has the majority of power resources. Anything else? Okay, the US is the most powerful state, which is the US is the unilateral power. Or, put differently, the US is the hegemon. It'll come later. The US is the hegemon, according to this table. The hegemon. Primus inter pares. The most powerful one, unilateral power or hegemon. No doubt about it. But, anything else? What's your name? 한현진, what do you think?
The great powers hold almost like 50% of the world's GDP.
You mean economic resources, right? Economic power. In terms of economic power, great powers accounts for more than 50% of the entire global GDP. Great Power Club accounts for 50% of the economic power, entire global economic power. You're right. You're right. But if I add one thing, the time frame of this figure is 2009, right? If we talk about 1940 or 1950, right after World War II, let's say 1950, how would this figure, GDP figure, look different? Yeah, obviously China much smaller, but the US alone, in terms of GDP, accounts for 50%, more than 50% after World War II, which means the US has shrunk in terms of GDP. Economic power, US economic power has shrunk pretty much, right? That's another thing. Now, compare, you see two most important power resources. Military power, particularly for realists, and economic power. These are two important sources, power sources. How do these different two power sources, how are they compared? What I'm saying is that the disparity between great powers and non-great powers, and the disparity between hegemon, the US, versus other great powers, larger in military power. That's what this table shows. Disparity is larger in military terms. Isn't it? Yeah, the gap in power, bigger from military perspective, which means America is much more powerful, militarily speaking, than in economic terms. This is important. It'll be an interesting exercise if you look up for some data about the entire GDP figure. As I recall, the entire global GDP is $65 trillion. today, $65 trillion. Of this, America, how much? Okay? If you write a research paper, America, how much? Okay, GDP figures. How much trillion, how many trillion? China, how many? Right? Things like that. That'll be interesting exercise. Next, neorealism. Neorealism. When you discuss realism, there are two kinds of realism. Traditional realism, classical realism, and contemporary, more modern realism. Modern realism is called neorealism, particularly after World War II. Right? The difference between classical realism and neorealism. Classical realism is much more rich, much more rich and diverse. Classical realism is about, like I said, among other things, about human nature. It is driven from the assumption about, some assumption about human nature. Right? It is also about, according to the textbook, geography, political will, diplomacy. These are all major concepts of classical realism. What is neorealism about? Particularly since the 1990s. New realism, particularly in the 1990s, is about power distribution. Okay? Neorealism, otherwise called structural realism, is about power distribution. And compared to classical realism, it's much more scientific. I mentioned this, much more scientific. They can predict the future based on power distribution. Much more scientific, but in terms of scope, a little bit narrower than classical realism. And according to this book, recently neoclassical realists have also emerged. Neoclassical. Now, power distribution. In terms of power distribution, there are three types of international systems. Number one, multipolar system. Multipolar system. Second, bipolar system. Third, unipolar system. Page 56, figure 2.4. Figure 2.4. It presents three different power distribution. Multipolar, bipolar, unipolar. Unipolar is hegemony. The controversy here is which is more stable. There is no definitive answer to this. But roughly speaking, there's a rough agreement that maybe unipolar, maybe most stable. Then comes bipolar. Multipolar, most unstable. Just rough agreement. Multipolar system. Typically, it has 5 to 6 centers of power. The best example, the European international system. the European international system, 1500, 2000, multipolar system. Multipolar system. Five to six equally powerful countries balance each other. That's multipolar system. The textbook says there is a tripolar system. Tripolar system is also possible. Kim Yoo-jin, give us an example of tripolar system in history. Like three powerful countries balancing each other, and thereby the system goes on. Any example? Tripolar system. Kim Min-kyung. Tripolar system.
In 1960s and 1970s, China balanced out the U.S. and Russia powers, and it made kind of like tripolar system.
So Russia, China, the U.S. Russia, China, U.S. And time frame 60s, 70s. Okay, you're right. But Kim Il-chang, China, Russia, the U.S. How come do they balance? How did it happen? Give us some background. Russia, China, U.S. Tripolar. Do you know anything about it? Tripolar. Was it really tripolar? Why China between the U.S. and Russia? The Soviet Union. Why China between Soviet Union and the U.S.? 신정아. Where is it? 신정아. Why China between the U.S. and the Soviet Union? Okay. Yeah, it is about history, 60s and 70s. 이경화.
I think the United States tried to make an alliance with China to defend Russia.
To challenge.
Challenge Russia or Soviet Union.
Okay. So the U.S. make an alliance with China in confronting the Soviet Union. Okay. 신훈지. Do you want to add something? '60s, '70s. What was international politics like at that time? Why was the U.S. Why did the U.S. need China?
Because wasn't it during Cold War?
Yes, Cold War.
Between Russia, between Soviet Union and the United States. So the United States want China to be alliance to the United States, so they can.
Right. The two main antagonists were the U.S., the Soviet Union. Right. After 1945, Soviet Union, the U.S., two antagonists, main antagonists. China had a very bad relationship with the Soviet Union. Same communist country, right? Same communist country. They hated capitalist countries, liberal countries. Both of them were enemies, right, of these capitalist countries. But China, the Soviet Union, despite same ideology and same antipathy for capitalism and democracy, so much, they hated each other. Many reasons. Number one, they have ideological variations. same communist ideology but different variations. Number two, they are neighbors. Russia, Soviet Union, China, they are neighbors, right? They share long borders in the eastern side, in the Asian continent. They have long borders shared. And they have conflicts over these territories. And they went to war several times over these territories. So they have a very bad relationship. They almost have they went to a war. They went to a war in 1969. Right? They are enemies. Right? Particularly so 50s, 60s. They were enemies. Festering relationship. The US, but on the other hand, the Soviet challenge to the United States over time became intense, more and more intense. Soviet challenge, particularly 60s, even more so 70s. The US was, in the 70s, was in a weak position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. So the 70s, the US needed China as an ally. Right? How did it happen? Ping-pong diplomacy. Right? Like a public diplomacy. Through informal channel, the US opened diplomatic relations with China. Early 1970s. That's tripolar. Do you know, my question, do you know when the Soviet Union and China became friends again? Throughout the Cold War, Soviet Union, China, they were enemies. But they became friends again. 1989. Since then, close. Soviet Union, China, since 89, close. Up to now. The reason? America, the US was becoming so powerful. So powerful. So Russia, China, seeing each other, they needed each other. Because America was so powerful. What is this? Balance of power. This is balance of power. Soviet Union, Russia, China today, throughout the 1990s, 2000s, they have a common front against the United States. Stage a common global front against the United States. Exactly the opposite. Because America is too strong. Now, another tripolar example. This textbook describes today as an example of tripolar. North America, Europe, Asia. Tripolar. Unipolar or hegemon is just one big state, one top state. Which is the United States, after 1991, after the Soviet Union collapsed. So technically, unipolarity lasted almost 2 decades, more than 2 decades. So that's multipolarity, bipolarity, tripolarity, unipolarity. Power transition theory. What is power transition theory? Power transition theory is a theory that holds that rise and fall of great powers, come with great wars. That's power transition theory. It's about great powers. It's about great powers. Power transition or rise and fall of great powers, same thing. Yunjae-sang, give us an example of power transition in history. What's the best example? Best example where wars break up when great power shift positions, which is power transition. What's the best example?
I'm not quite sure if you recall at that time Germany, when they had wars about like Nazis and all that, and the war broke up and basically collapsed the United States and other allies power over.
Okay, you're talking about wars breaking up, but you didn't discuss different powers, shifting, exchanging positions. Germany rose, you're right, but who declined instead? Germany rose, right? Germany rose. When? When did Germany rose? Hmm?
After the World War I.
No, even before that. You're talking about even before that. After World War I, already the war times. There were many things that happened before war times, right? Which is power transition. Power transition first. Wars come later, right? Wars, World War I, World War II, these are wars, right? But power transition before world wars. What's the power transition like that led to World War I, World War II? Rise and fall of great powers. Germany rose, but who declined? Britain declined, okay? France even earlier than that, right? So the status quo power, the powers that held power were clearly Germany. Britain. Britain was the most powerful country. Britain was the most powerful country, right? Then challenger was Germany. So Britain was declining, right? Britain was declining. Germany was rising. Russia was also rising, right? Those are revisionist powers. So revisionist new powers challenging status quo powers. How come did Germany rise? Or how come did Russia rise? Right? Rise and fall of great powers, a lot of stories about military forces, economic power, right? How did the Great Britain decline? Long story. Long story. Then again, comparison. Is there any comparison between Great Britain in the 19th century, the US in the 21st century, today? The definition, the term hegemony originated from an Italian political scientist. Is he Italian? Antonio Gramsci. He provided definition of hegemony first. What definition did he give? According to a little bit different definition. 58, page 58. 6 from the top. The Italian Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci. He's the one who used this term first. When he used this term, he referred to this. This was the original definition of hegemony. The complex of ideas. The complex of ideas that rulers use to gain consent for their legitimacy and keep subjects in line, reducing the need to use force to accomplish the same goal. Like sort of a brainwashing. That's the original meaning of hegemony when he used it first. But this term is like a transplanted onto international politics, where when there is a power that has a preponderance of power vis-a-vis other states, then that's hegemonic power. There are two examples of hegemonic powers in history. The UK in the 19th century, in the 18th and 19th century, the UK, historically, the first hegemonic system. And the US in the 20th century, even stronger in the 21st century. US hegemony, British hegemony, US hegemony. There are many books and articles that compare and contrast British hegemony, US hegemony. How did US hegemony decline? How did it rise? How did it rise? How did it decline? Is the US declining? Right? How did the US rise? Is the US declining? Is China rising instead? China's rise, right? China's rise today, Germany's rise in the 19th century, or Russia's rise in the 19th century, right? Things like that. Those are the probably most hotly debated, most sophisticated like kind of controversies in international relations. This textbook raises I can't remove this sound. Does anyone know how to remove this sound? Huh? I don't know how to do this. But this sound rings even when I suppress the cell phone. That's very strange. it would be appreciated if you could tell me how to remove this sound after class. Hegemony, according to this textbook, hegemony is similar to a central government in terms of roles they play. Because unipolar is most stable. The reason unipolar is stable is that hegemony enforces some rules and principles, thereby resolving the so-called the collective goods problem. That's the role of hegemony. By enforcing rules and principles, hegemony is able to resolve some collective goods problem. That's the beauty of hegemony. And it goes on to ask, then how come a hegemon enforces those rules and principles even as it has its own national interest? It's a very intriguing question. Like, for instance, the British hegemony, the UK in the 19th century. Did the UK sacrifice her own national interest to provide public goods to international society? Or is the United States sacrificing her own national interest to maintain peace and expand economic growth? Right? Two main goals, peace and trade promotion, right? Hegemons, their role is to maintain peace, promote global trade, right? But peace and trade, both, like we discussed, has collective goods problem, right? Every country pursuing its own self-interest, right? Leading to uncoordination, right? Irrational outcome. When there is a hegemon emerging, then this uncoordination problem disappears. But on resolving uncoordination problem, to do that, someone should make sacrifice, right? Hegemon may be doing that. Let me ask you one question. 임승철, about U.S. hegemony, like looking back, 1960s, 1970s, 80s, 90s, either maintaining peace or global trade promotion. What kind of role did the United States play as a hegemon in expanding trade, maintaining peace?
It was really active in a lot of wars, like the Serbian War, which the NATO forces intervened and tried to stop both sides from fighting. And I think in some countries also in Africa, they intervened a lot as well. But sometimes they have received criticism, like a lot of them like the Gulf War, over intervening, I think. But it's the same they do. To a certain extent,
international police. So hegemon's role is policing. Policing. So do you think the US played a beneficial, benevolent role for the world? So peace and economic growth in the 20th century, how big was the role of the United States, in your opinion? Okay, think about it. 이서정, how big was the United States role? Was the US benevolent power, sacrificing sometimes, care about public goods, common interest rather than self-interest, particularly as every other country pursues its own self-interest?
Relatively, I believe that U.S. played
It was a benevolent power. Okay, anyone else? 한현지, what do you think? Enforcing rules and principles, avoiding collective goods problem. Give us one example where the US played that benevolent role. In general, are we all in some agreement over this? Hegemon? Okay. Right. Hegemon is kind of a quasi central government role, right? Policing or making sure like everyone's self-interest coordinated, things like that, right? When a certain country is too ambitious, like North Korea, right? Taming their ambitions, right? Things like that. Or sometimes sacrificing. Like one example, after World War II, German economy, Japanese economy demolished, right? Korea, very poor. What these countries are good at is they are good at producing, right? Producing products, right? Products like Korean at the time, Koreans were good at making very basic things out of factory, right? Then more sophisticated ones, but was about much more labor intensive, right? What was needed for these countries was they needed market, right? They needed market. Germany, Japan, Korea, same thing. These formerly poor countries, particularly after World War II, they needed market, right? The US provided market, right? Preferential market. That's the hegemon's role, preferential market. The US didn't care about making profits. The US just opened the market, right? Opened the market, and yeah, I mean, did Koreans a favor, did Japanese a favor, did Germans a favor. That's what the United States did. For the good of peace, for the good of economic development. Right? So in that sense, the United States, they made a sacrifice. Right? Particularly 60s, 70s. I think that's a good role. That's a good role, and that's how global trade began to expand. But over time, when German economy grows and becomes a normal state, normal economy, when Japan grows and becomes a normal state, and it becomes a too normal state, then began to challenge the United States economy. Then the US began to change. Right? Began to change. Close the market, right? Making sure the trade is fair. That comes later. But in the beginning, the US did a lot of favor as a hegemon. But overall, the US was making sure the entire game of trade or security is fair for everyone, right? That's a good role as a hegemon, right? Sometimes punishing, right, rule breakers, right? That's the good role of a hegemon. The British, yes, British I think did similar role. The British and the US play similar role in that sense, right? Enforcing rules. To enforce that, as I mentioned, to enforce that you need, as a hegemon, you need military force. Military force, and you need a convincing value. You need to have a convincing value. Right? Both British and the US, they appealed. They appealed to the entire world because they had a very good convincing value, which is free market. Nobody can deny that. Right? Level playing field. Right? Level playing field. Everyone should have a level playing field. No one can deny that. Free market principle, democratic value. No one can deny that. These two things, British, US, same. That's how they led the world as a hegemon. Sometimes they are distracted, though. Right? Sometimes they're distracted because they have their own national interests. Sometimes they're distracted, sometimes they're going crazy. But overall, they were good. Military force, the UK proceeded from was naval power, mostly. Right? British military force was naval power. The US, well, it's not naval alone, but much more comprehensive, right? And alliance. I think the biggest character of the U.S. military force is alliance system throughout the world, right? Having military bases every place. That's the U.S. like a military force. Let me ask some question outside this textbook. You now know a little bit about how the hegemonic system run, right? Like you need military power, you need economic power, right? You need more universal values, right? Appealing universal values. Probably this is why China has a hard time playing a hegemonic power. Because China doesn't have a universally appealing value. That's the weakness China has. Now, but there are things that this textbook doesn't cover as a hegemonic power, right? You need both British hegemonic system and the United system, U.S. hegemonic system. They had a currency power. Currency power. In other words, their own national currency is not only circulating within the state boundary, but play as an international reserve currency. Like sterling, British sterling in the 19th century is not only British money, but also international money. That's very important. Currency power in the financial system, right? It's not only British money, but international money. Dollar is the currency Americans use, but also every other country also use it, right? So international, not only US currency, but also international currency. That's how global financial system is run. Global financial system. So hegemonic power must have currency power, international currency power, right? That's how the UK, the US ruled global financial system. Global financial system. So, in other words, when the British hegemonic system declined and came to a stop, finally, there are several symptoms, but one of the symptoms is British money no longer used as an international money. That's probably the most outstanding symptom of a hegemony decline, right? Now, Witzker-Andrew, do you think the US dollar system, both as a US national currency and an international currency, do you think when you say American hegemony is in decline, do you see some sort of a decline in the US dollar as an international currency?
I think it's still globally used, but you can see that the dollar is worth less than like the pounds, for example. So, but it's still globally used. So in that way, you cannot tell.
Okay. All right. When do you see the dollar declining as an international currency or hegemonic currency? Give us some specific examples where maybe the US dollar system is in crisis. We have had many examples like that. Raise your hand if you know. If you read about it in newspapers, raise your hand if you know. Just one person? Two? Just give us an examples. Okay, gentlemen.
When the oil prices goes down.
When the oil prices goes down,
Yeah.
then what?
Then the American currency also goes down.
American currency also goes down.
Yes. Because I think American system is really depend on the price of oil, and that is why it's like because all of the countries using the oil, so they like interconnected to the oil system, and that is why if the price goes down, as American is hegemonic country, it's also the American currency goes down. So this is an example.
Okay. You are raising two different things, but your point is that when the U.S. power is in full swing, right? The dollar value should be strong,
Yes.
right? When the dollar value is weak, that signifies something going wrong with the United States or with U.S. power.
Yeah.
Energy thing, just wait. That's different thing. Energy is different thing. 이현종.
I see more like military example, like right after 9/11, US dollar were a lot less than before, and they
You mean fell?
yeah
Value
they
fell.
deployed a lot of Marines into Israel, and like people were protesting about it a lot, and political issues were rising, and that political instability kind of got U.S. dollar to like remarkably less.
Right. Only two people know about this issue: currency, financial system. Yes. What's your name? Gensha. Okay. That's a good idea. Very good idea.
Not completely sure, but as an idea, for example, the American economy has been in crisis for many years, and the Chinese economy has been rising. So maybe people think it's not as favorable to trade in dollar anymore, but in Chinese currency.
Okay. Yeah, I think the best scenario for the United States as a hegemon, as a currency hegemon, more specifically, in particular, as a currency hegemon, the best scenario for the United States, in other words, what the United States wants to see most is everyone, every country needing dollars. That's the best scenario in either everyday business transaction or long-term business deals or even bigger state business deals. The best scenario for the United States is, in every case, the dollar is the basic unit. That's what the United States wants to see. The reason? That's how the United States make contribution, because it's a unit of transaction, right? It's a good thing. In so doing, the United States resolving currency uncoordination problem, currency collective goods problem, right? One. Second, in so doing, America profits a lot, make a huge profit. Huge profit. You can imagine, right? But the worst scenario for the United States is every country, including individuals, particularly central bank of like Korea, central bank of China, or central bank of Saudi Arabia, those who hold a lot of money in the basement, when they decide to sell the dollar holdings they have, it's asset, their asset, national asset, that's a nightmare for the United States. Why do they do that? Why do Korean central banks decide to, sell dollar assets? When they think that the dollar value is falling, they need to sell it. They must do it, otherwise they lose their assets, right? So it's important for the United States, giving the impression that the dollar is stable, right? Don't sell it, the dollar is stable, right? That's the best scenario. And that has been the way for many decades. But when the United States was in crisis, when the financial system was in crisis, when the dollar was in crisis, particularly those, as he suggested, particularly those who export oil and gas, they asked for replacement currency instead of dollar. Right? That's a threat to the United States. That's what Saddam Hussein did. That's what Iranian president did, right? From the 1990s. But Saddam Hussein is gone today, right? Energy is another thing. As a hegemon. Why energy management is important as a hegemon? Energy management is so important for hegemon. Or energy as a collective goods is so important because energy is not equally distributed. Energy is not equally distributed. Oil and gas is not equally distributed. Oil and gas is found only in a few small number of countries. They monopolize it. So, in order to make sure that every country enjoys oil and gas and energy, every country uses it for economic development, some kind of hegemonic interference is possible, is needed, both in the UK system and the United States hegemonic system. That's one of the probably most important goals of hegemons. Oil and gas. Clearly, as he indicated, oil and gas, energy, dollar, related. Closely related. We don't have time to get into details, but closely related. That's a very interesting topic later for your study. That's additional points outside the textbook. Final question from the textbook. When and how does the hegemon decline? What does this textbook answer that question? When and how does the hegemon decline? The answer is here, 58, page 58. Fourth from the bottom. Hegemonic decline may occur, particularly when hegemons have overextended themselves with costly military commitments. This is the most important reason for decline. Most important reason for decline. that's it for today. Tuesday, next Tuesday, I'm going to quickly cover. You need to go ahead and read section on alliances, okay, on your own. Read it. I may touch upon it a little bit, but mostly chapter 3. Tuesday, chapter 3.